Hey everyone, my name is Bo Sanders, and I want to tell you about some lessons from Luke that we learned reading it for nearly a year. The first is that you should read slowly. Reading slowly is really key. The second is that Luke is a quilter. I'll talk more about that in a minute. The third thing is that parables are tricky. The fourth thing is that Jesus winks. And the last thing is that bread is really central. The first thing to talk about is reading the Bible slowly. We have this unique collection of people in our progressive Bible study. We call it In Bible Study because we read and then we go and imbibe and talk about it. Where some people are lifelong liberals and maybe haven't read the Bible that much. And then there are others of us who are emergent from an evangelical world. We're sort of post-evangelical. And then there are just a number of people who are sort of curious and in the middle of the road. And that dynamic of those three groups being under one tent really leads to some quite interesting conversations. But the key is that when you think you already know what the story's about, that you already have the plot and you already have the conclusion, you tend to read the Bible really quickly. And you skip over some important elements of the narrative. Versus with us, what we figured out is because we don't assume that we know what the story's about, we read it really slowly and take all of the details right to account. We give them their full weight. And what happens is meaning emerges in the wrestling, in the slow progress that opens up the narrative to some amazing details emerge. Second thing I want to talk about is that Luke is a quilter. And we noticed as we went through, sometimes we would compare it to Mark or Matthew, the synoptic gospels they get called, and sometimes to John, which was written much later. But that Luke not only had Mark, scholars tell us had Mark, but that he also had done his own research, because he wrote quite a bit later, and that he pieces together the fabric of these stories in unique ways, often very different than Mark and Matthew, but sometimes he introduces new material, but sometimes he just rearranges the same stories that you would be familiar with, but he pairs them together. He knits them, or you might want to say, or we're using a quilting analogy, that he lines up the squares, the fabric of the stories, in a unique way to compare and contrast them or juxtapose them. And that it's actually in this pairing, the coupling, that he wants you to see something. And so when you step back and look at how he pieces together, knits together the fabric of the story, that some really interesting things come through. The third thing we kept bumping into is that parables are tricky. They are stories. They're small stories. They're often about earthy things like birds or fields or trees. Sometimes they're about unexpected heroes like widows or servants. And what they do is they come in underneath your radar and then ask you to interrogate the assumptions that you came in with. They want to challenge the status quo and ask, is the way things are, is it the way they need to be? So two interesting elements of this is that the parables of Jesus often make a hero out of somebody who the listener may not have thought very highly of, like foreigners or servants or women. And the second thing is it calls into question the power of wealth and of upper class assumptions to talk about who God works through and who God is with and who God's favor is for. So take Luke 16, for instance. It's a parable about a beggar named Lazarus and a rich man at his gate. And so they both end up in the afterlife. And Jesus isn't giving us a landscape or a map of what the afterlife looks like because they're talking back and forth, right? So we don't take this as like literal, but we do take it seriously because some interesting elements of the story is that Jesus names the beggar. That would have been a surprise to the first century audience, because he doesn't name the rich man, who everyone in town would have known the rich man's name. So that's a great reversal. And for that first century audience, they would have thought that God's blessing was evident with the rich man. I mean, that's why he was blessed. But it turns out that's not who God's favor was with. So that's a second great reversal. Another really surprising thing that came out of parables is that they are not allegories. Many of us have been taught in children's Sunday school to read the parable as an allegory, and so we take the individual characters in the parable and we assign to them virtues or people in real life. And what results from reading a parable as an allegory is that you often get it 100% reversed from what the point really is. And so, for instance, if you take every powerful person, like a landowner or the head of something, and you a kingly figure, whatever, and you a ruler, and you make them the God character, you end up making this monstrous picture of God who is not only double-minded, duplicitous, but cruel and vicious and violent. And so when you read a parable as an allegory, you often make God into a monster. Which brings us to our next point, which is that Jesus often speaks with a wink. Wink. So like in Luke chapter 12, verse 38 and 40, we see Jesus' teaching reads very differently if you're riding high on the hog, in this case empire, than if you are on the underside of the beast. If you have a lot of possessions and security, safety, like many Americans do, then the idea of a thief in the night is terrifying. But if you are outside the systems of power, the castle, the palace, then the idea of a midnight raid means something good, right? Something different, upturning the apple cart. And in this scenario, Jesus' kingdom that he's talking about, the kingdom of God, the insurrection, the inbreaking of a different reign and rule of God's work in the world, it comes like a thief in the night and it surprises people. And that insurrection would actually be an encouraging thing, where the disciples are actually like the pirates. They are the thieves, right? Through which God ambushes and ransacks the house of the powerful. We saw this because in the previous chapter, in Luke chapter 11, Jesus had talked about binding the strong man if you're going to ransack his house. And it was probably an allusion to the Roman rule, or Caesar in this case would be the strong man. So this happens a lot where Jesus alludes to somebody, the strong man or the one, which we'll talk about in a second. And he's not talking about God. And this is where the problem comes with always assigning the God character to one of Jesus's teachings. It really confuses the issue. I'll give you for instance. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus says, I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, but after that can do nothing more. But I will warn you for whom to fear. Fear him who after he is killed has the authority to cast you into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. And then he says, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten in God's sight. But even the hairs of your head are all counted. Do not be afraid. You are of more value than any sparrows. So in this parable, Jesus is saying, don't fear the one who can only kill your body, which, by the way, is terrifying. I'm going to fear that person. But who, after they kill you, can throw you into that garbage heap outside of town and destroy your soul or your shot at everlasting life. Right? That's the curse of being cast into hell, this Gehenna, this burning garbage pit outside of town, the valley of Gehenna. And that would have been Rome. So why didn't Jesus just say Rome? Why does he speak with a wink? Well, it's because when you are not safe to say what you really think, you have to speak in code. And this is both like the book of Revelation, right? Apocalyptic talk, but also parables. They perform this function. Jesus often alludes, so when he says the one, he's not the one who can cast you into hell is not God, because he names God in verse 6. So verse 5, when he says the one, he's talking about somebody else with a wink. Probably somebody whose soldier was standing on the edge of the crowd that Jesus was talking to. Because then he says God cares about even the sparrow. So this idea that the one who can cast you into hell after you're dead, being God, is the exact inverse of what we're supposed to get out of this and why we're not supposed to be afraid. The last lesson from Luke is that bread is really important. Luke actually talks more about food and bread specifically than all of the other Gospels. It plays a really important role in Luke's narrative. In fact, if you were to ask me what's the big takeaway from the Gospel of Luke, I would say that it's found at the very end in chapter 24, and it's in verse 35, and it says this. And they told about the things that had happened on the road, this is the disciples, and how he, Jesus, was known to them in the breaking of bread. So he had broken the bread, and their eyes were open to his identity. They perceived Christ. So it may surprise you, it surprised me, that the major point of Luke's gospel might be that Christ is known in the breaking of bread. I've been thinking a lot about this since we wrapped up last month our reading of Luke. And it's really ironic to me that we weren't able to celebrate with a meal. When we finish a book of the Bible, we usually celebrate with a meal, and we weren't able to do that because Luke ends with this thing about Christ being revealed in the breaking of bread. All right, so those are my lessons from Luke. I hope that you have found that interesting. I would love your feedback or your comments, especially if you have read Luke recently and any of your things that you would add. I hope that you'll join us this fall. We're going to try some different readings from the Hebrew Testament. We're going to try and read some minor prophets, both Amos and Hosea, and we're going to see what they have to say to us. So Wednesday nights at 7 p.m., you can join us online. I'll look forward to seeing you there.